Jake Morrison sat alone in the darkest corner of the Silver Dollar Saloon, staring into his glass of whiskey like it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The amber liquid burned going down, but it was nothing compared to the fire that had been eating away at his insides for the past 6 months. The other men in the saloon gave him space now. They had learned that Jake wasn't looking for company or conversation. He came here to drink and remember and sometimes to forget, though forgetting never seemed to work no matter how much whiskey he poured down his throat. At 32, Jake felt like his life had ended on that cold February night when the world took away everything that mattered to him. Before that night, he had been a different man entirely. People used to say Jake Morrison could light up a room just by walking into it. He told the best stories, had the loudest laugh, and could make even the grumpiest old rancher crack a smile. That Jake had died along with Helen and their baby son. Jake could still remember the exact moment he had fallen in love with Helen. She had come to Cedar Ridge to teach at the little schoolhouse. Stepping off the stagecoach with her red hair gleaming in the sunlight and her green dress neat as a pin, despite the long journey. When she smiled at him after church that first Sunday, Jake felt like he had been struck by lightning. It had taken him 3 whole months to work up the courage to ask her to have dinner with him. Every time he tried to approach her, his tongue would tie itself in knots and he would end up just tipping his hat and mumbling something about the weather. Finally, his friend Tom had gotten so tired of watching Jake make a fool of himself that he physically pushed him in Helen's direction. "Miss Helen," Jake had stammered, his hat clutched in his sweaty hands. "I was wondering if you might like to have dinner with me Saturday evening." Helen had looked up from the book she was reading and smiled that smile that made Jake's knees go weak. "I would like that very much, Mr. Morrison." Their courtship had been the happiest time of Jake's life. Helen was everything he had never dared to hope for in a wife. She was smart and funny, kind to everyone she met, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. When she laughed at his jokes, Jake felt 10 feet tall. When she took his arm as they walked through town, he felt like the luckiest man alive. The proposal had been simple but perfect. Jake had taken Helen on a picnic to the spot on his ranch where the creek ran clear and cold, with wildflowers growing thick along the banks. As they sat on the blanket Helen had made specially for their outings, Jake had pulled out the ring he had been carrying in his pocket for 2 weeks. Too nervous to present it. "Helen," he had said, dropping to one knee beside the creek, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Helen had said yes before he even finished the question, tears of joy streaming down her face as she threw her arms around his neck. They had sat by that creek until sunset, making plans for their future together. The wedding had been the biggest celebration Cedar Ridge had seen in years. It seemed like everyone in 3 counties had come to wish them well. Helen had looked like an angel in her white dress, and Jake had never been so proud of anything in his life as he was of the woman walking down the aisle toward him. Their first year of marriage had been pure happiness. Helen had turned Jake's bachelor house into a real home, with curtains on the windows and flowers in the garden. She had a gift for making everything beautiful and comfortable. Jake would come in from working the ranch to find fresh bread cooling on the kitchen table, and Helen humming as she prepared their dinner. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and plan their future together. Jake wanted to expand his cattle operation and build a bigger house. Helen wanted a vegetable garden and maybe some chickens. They both wanted children, lots of them. Helen would rest her hand on Jake's arm and talk about the nursery they would build upstairs, about teaching their children to ride horses and read books. When Helen told Jake she was expecting their first baby, he had picked her up and spun her around the kitchen until she was dizzy and laughing. That night they had lain in bed with Jake's hand on Helen's still flat belly, talking about names and wondering if the baby would have Helen's red hair or Jake's brown eyes. Jake had never been happier than during those months when Helen was carrying their child. He would catch himself grinning for no reason while he worked, just thinking about becoming a father. He started building a cradle in the barn during his spare time, carving it from the finest wood he could find. Everything changed on that February night when the baby decided to come early. Helen had been having pains all day, but she insisted they were nothing to worry about. "First babies take their time," she had said, trying to smile through a contraction. "My mother always said so." But as the hours passed, Helen grew pale and weak. The pains were coming faster and harder, and Jake could see fear creeping into his wife's eyes. When he suggested riding to town for the doctor, Helen grabbed his hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "Please don't leave me alone." So Jake stayed, feeling helpless as he watched his wife suffer through labor that seemed to go on forever. He held Helen's hand, brought her water, and tried to stay calm while inside he was falling apart with worry. By midnight, Jake knew something was terribly wrong. Helen was barely conscious between contractions, and there was too much blood. Against Helen's wishes, he saddled his fastest horse and rode through the snow to fetch Doc Wilson from town. The ride back to the ranch took forever, even though Jake pushed his horse as hard as he dared. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. When they finally reached the house, Jake's heart stopped at the silence that greeted them. Doc Wilson took one look at the scene and shook his head sadly. "There was nothing anyone could have done," he explained gently. "Sometimes these things just happened, and there was no explaining why God took some people so young." Helen was gone. The baby, a perfect little boy they had planned to name Thomas, had never drawn breath. In one terrible night, Jake had lost his entire future. The funeral had been a blur of sympathetic faces and well-meaning words that meant nothing. People talked about God's plan and how Helen and the baby were in a better place now, but Jake didn't want to hear any of it. If God's plan involved taking away an innocent woman and baby, then Jake wanted nothing to do with God. For weeks after the burial, neighbors had brought food and offered help around the ranch. The ladies from church had cleaned his house and done his laundry. Everyone meant well, but their kindness only made Jake feel worse. He didn't deserve their concern when he had failed to protect the two people who mattered most to him. Gradually, people stopped coming by so often. Life went on for everyone else, but Jake remained frozen in that February night when his world fell apart. He did the basic work needed to keep his cattle alive, but everything else fell by the wayside. Helen's garden became overgrown with weeds. The house grew dusty and cold. The cradle Jake had been carving sat unfinished in the barn, covered with a tarp he couldn't bear to remove. The saloon became Jake's refuge from the emptiness of his house and the memories that haunted every room. Here, surrounded by strangers and the noise of other people's conversations, he could drink until the sharp edges of his grief became fuzzy and manageable. Now, 6 months later, Jake felt no closer to healing than he had the day Helen died. People kept telling him it would get easier with time, but time seemed to be making everything worse instead of better. Every day that passed took him further away from his life with Helen, and he didn't know how to exist in a world where she didn't belong. Reverend Matthews had been losing sleep over 2 members of his congregation. Every night when he said his prayers, he found himself asking God what he could do to help Jake Morrison and Clara Whitmore, 2 souls who seemed to be drowning in their own separate oceans of despair. The Reverend had been the spiritual leader of Cedar Ridge for 15 years, and he had seen his share of human suffering. But there was something about these 2 particular cases that weighed heavily on his heart. Both Jake and Clara were good people who had been dealt harsh blows by life, and both seemed to be giving up hope for any kind of future happiness. Clara had been living behind his church for nearly 3 weeks now, helping his wife Ruth with cleaning and organizing in exchange for a place to sleep and meals. She never complained, never asked for anything beyond basic necessities, but Reverend Matthews could see the quiet desperation in her eyes. Winter was coming fast, and he couldn't let her sleep in that tiny, unheated room much longer. Jake was a different kind of problem, but equally troubling. The vibrant, hopeful young man who had married Helen Morrison 3 years ago had become a ghost of himself. Reverend Matthews had performed Helen's funeral service, had seen the devastating grief in Jake's eyes as they lowered his wife and child into the ground. But 6 months had passed, and instead of beginning to heal, Jake seemed to be sinking deeper into darkness. After Sunday service, while most of the congregation headed home for their family dinners, Reverend Matthews made his decision. He approached Jake, who was lingering by his horse as usual, clearly reluctant to return to his empty ranch house. "Jake," the Reverend called out, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of counseling troubled souls. "Could I have a word with you?" Jake looked up, his eyes bloodshot from another night at the saloon. "I suppose, Reverend. Though if this is about coming back to church regular-like, I'm not ready for that conversation." "It's not about church," Reverend Matthews said gently. "It's about you, and about Miss Clara." They walked together away from the remaining churchgoers toward the small cemetery behind the building where Helen and baby Thomas were buried. Jake's jaw tightened as they passed the familiar headstones, but he didn't turn away. "I've been watching both of you these past weeks," the Reverend began carefully, "and I've been praying about a situation that's been troubling me greatly." Jake kicked at a small stone with the toe of his boot. "What situation is that?" "Miss Clara is in a desperate position, Jake. She has no money to return east, no family to help her, and no way to support herself alone. Winter's coming, and I can't keep letting her sleep in that church room. It's not proper and it's not safe." "I know all that," Jake said quietly. "Everyone in town knows Clara's situation, but I don't see what it has to do with me." Reverend Matthews stopped walking and turned to face Jake directly. "When I look at you, I see a man who's forgotten how to live. Your ranch is falling apart, you're not taking care of yourself, and you're drinking away your grief instead of facing it." Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? I've been ministering to grieving people for 15 years, Jake. I know what it looks like when someone gives up on life, and I know that Helen Morrison would be heartbroken to see what you've become." The mention of Helen's name hit Jake like a physical blow. "Don't you dare tell me what Helen would want. You didn't know her like I did?" "You're right," the Reverend said calmly, "but I knew her well enough to know she loved you deeply. And I don't believe for one second that she would want you to waste away in a saloon, letting everything you two built together fall to ruin." They stood in tense silence for a moment, Jake breathing hard with suppressed emotion. Finally, Reverend Matthews played the card he'd been considering for days. "I have a proposition for both of you," he said quietly. "Something that could solve Clara's problem and maybe help you remember how to be human again." Jake looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of proposition?" "Marriage." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake stared at the Reverend as if he had suggested something completely insane. "Have you lost your mind?" Jake finally managed. "I can't marry someone else. I'm still married to Helen in my heart." "I'm not talking about love, Jake," Reverend Matthews said patiently. "I'm talking about partnership. Two people helping each other through difficult times." Jake began pacing back and forth, his agitation clear. "You want me to marry a complete stranger?" "Clara isn't a stranger. She's been part of our community for weeks. She's kind, hardworking, and decent. More importantly, she doesn't expect romance or grand gestures. She needs security, and you need someone to help you get your life back on track." "This is crazy," Jake muttered, but the Reverend could see he was actually considering it. "Think about it practically," Reverend Matthews continued. "Your house needs a woman's touch. You're not eating properly, not keeping up with basic household management. Clara could take care of those things, help you get organized again." "And what would she get out of it?" Jake asked. "A roof over her head, protection, and the respect that comes with being a married woman. It would be a business arrangement, Jake. You'd both be getting something you need." Jake stopped pacing and leaned against the cemetery fence, staring out at the mountains in the distance. "You've already talked to her about this, haven't you?" Reverend Matthews nodded. "I mentioned the possibility. She didn't say no immediately, which tells me she's desperate enough to consider it." "What did she say?" "She asked for time to think and pray about it. The same thing I'm asking of you." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both men lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke again. "I couldn't love her," he said quietly. "My heart died with Helen. I don't have anything left to give someone else. Clara understands that. She's not looking for a grand love story, Jake. Her heart has been broken too. She just needs someone who will treat her with kindness and respect." Jake thought about his empty house, the meals he barely bothered to prepare, the way he had been living like a man just waiting to die. Maybe the Reverend had a point. Maybe having another person around, someone to cook decent meals and keep things organized, would help him function better. "What would people say?" Jake asked. "People will say you're both being smart and practical. Marriage doesn't always have to be about passionate love, Jake. Sometimes it's about two people helping each other survive." The Reverend pulled out his pocket watch and glanced at it. "I don't need an answer today. But think about it. Pray about it if you're so inclined. And remember that sometimes God provides solutions in ways we don't expect." As they walked back toward the church, Jake's mind was spinning with possibilities he had never considered. The idea of marriage felt wrong, like he would be betraying Helen's memory. But the idea of having purpose again, of helping someone else while maybe helping himself, was strangely appealing. "If I were to consider this," Jake said slowly, "what would the arrangement look like?" "Whatever you two decide it should look like," the Reverend replied. "Separate bedrooms, shared meals, divided responsibilities. You'd be partners, not lovers. Companions, not sweethearts." When they reached Jake's horse, the Reverend put a gentle hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Helen loved you, Jake. She wanted you to have a good life. Don't you think she would want you to find a way to keep living instead of just existing?" Jake mounted his horse without answering, but Reverend Matthews could see the wheels turning in his mind. As Jake rode away toward his lonely ranch, the Reverend offered up a silent prayer that God would guide both Jake and Clara toward a decision that could save them both from the despair that threatened to consume them. Sometimes, he reflected, the most unlikely solutions turned out to be exactly what people needed. The morning of the wedding felt more like the day of a business meeting than the beginning of a marriage. Clara stood in the small room behind the church, looking at herself in the cracked mirror that hung on the wall. The simple blue dress she had borrowed from Ruth Matthews was pretty enough, but it felt wrong somehow. This wasn't how she had ever imagined her wedding day would be. 3 days had passed since Jake had finally agreed to Reverend Matthews's proposition. The conversation between Clara and Jake had been awkward and formal, more like two people negotiating the terms of employment than planning a life together. Jake had come to see her at the church, his hat in his hands and his eyes focused anywhere except on her face. Clara could see the reluctance in every line of his body, and she felt a stab of familiar shame. Even in a marriage of convenience, she was still the woman nobody really wanted. "I can offer you a home and protection," Jake had said, his voice carefully neutral. "I have a good ranch, enough money to live comfortably. You'd want for nothing in terms of basic needs." Clara had nodded, trying to match his businesslike tone. "I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, manage a household. I won't be a burden to you." "I need to be clear about something," Jake had continued, finally meeting her eyes. "I can't love you. My heart belongs to my first wife, and that won't change. This would be a partnership, nothing more." The words stung, even though Clara had expected them. "I understand. I'm not looking for love either. I just need security." They had shaken hands on the arrangement like two men closing a cattle deal. No romance, no pretense, just two desperate people agreeing to help each other survive. Now, on their wedding morning, Clara wondered if they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. She had been married before, or almost married anyway, and that ceremony had been planned for months with excitement and joy. This felt like stepping off a cliff into complete darkness. Ruth Matthews knocked softly on the door and entered with a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from her garden. "You look lovely, dear," she said kindly, though Clara could see the worry in her eyes. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Clara asked quietly. Ruth considered the question seriously. "I think you're both doing what you need to do to survive. Sometimes that's the most anyone can ask for." Clara took a deep breath and smoothed down her skirt. "I'm ready." Jake was already waiting at the front of the church when Clara walked down the short aisle. He looked uncomfortable in his dark suit, like a man attending a funeral rather than his own wedding. His face was pale, and Clara could see his hands trembling slightly as he waited for her to join him. Reverend Matthews and his wife were the only witnesses to the ceremony. The Reverend had offered to invite other members of the congregation, but both Jake and Clara had declined. This wasn't a celebration, and they didn't want to pretend otherwise. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, but the familiar words felt strange when spoken to an almost empty church. Clara tried to focus on what he was saying, but her mind kept wandering to her first wedding attempt in Chicago, when the church had been packed with family and friends. When it came time for vows, Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "I promise to provide for you and protect you for as long as we both shall live." He had clearly practiced the words, but they sounded rehearsed rather than heartfelt. Clara's own vows were equally modified from the traditional ceremony. "I promise to be a faithful companion and partner to you in all things." She couldn't bring herself to promise to love, honor, and obey when love wasn't part of their agreement. The ring Jake slipped onto her finger was a simple gold band he had purchased from the general store. It felt strange and heavy on her hand, nothing like the elaborate engagement ring William had given her years ago. But this ring represented something different. Security rather than romance, survival rather than dreams. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, Jake simply nodded at Clara and shook the minister's hand, like they had just completed some necessary paperwork. "May God bless your union," Ruth Matthews said warmly, trying to inject some joy into the somber occasion. She hugged Clara tightly and whispered, "Give it time, dear. Sometimes the best things grow slowly." Clara signed her name in the church register as Clara Morrison, and the strangeness of her new identity hit her like a physical blow. She was married now, for better or worse, to a man who had made it clear he could never love her. The ride to Jake's ranch took nearly an hour through the Montana countryside. They sat side by side on the wagon seat, but they might as well have been strangers sharing a ride to town. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, and Clara focused on the landscape around them, both avoiding conversation. Clara tried to imagine what her life would be like now. She would cook Jake's meals, clean his house, maybe help with some of the ranch work. In return, she would have a roof over her head and enough food to eat. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was better than facing winter alone with nowhere to go. When they finally reached the ranch, Clara's first impression was of beauty overshadowed by neglect. The house was well built and had obviously been loved once, but everything looked tired and forgotten. Weeds grew in what had once been flower gardens, and the porch needed fresh paint. "Helen planted those roses," Jake said, pointing to an overgrown patch near the front steps. It was the first time he had mentioned his first wife's name since their conversation with Reverend Matthews. Clara could see the bones of what had once been a beautiful garden. "They're good varieties," she said carefully. "With some work, they could bloom again." Jake looked at her with something that might have been surprise, but he didn't respond. Instead, he carried her single suitcase into the house and showed her to her room. The bedroom was pleasant enough, with a window that looked out toward the mountains. It had clearly been prepared as a guest room rather than a wife's room, with simple furniture and no personal touches. Clara appreciated that Jake had made the boundaries of their arrangement clear, even in the sleeping arrangements. "I usually eat breakfast at sunrise and dinner when the work is done," Jake said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "If you need anything from town, make a list and I'll pick it up on my next trip." "What about supplies for cooking?" Clara asked. "I should know what's available in the pantry." Jake showed her through the kitchen, and Clara was dismayed by what she found. The basics were there: coffee, beans, some preserved meat, but there were no fresh vegetables, no variety, no ingredients for making decent meals. It was the pantry of a man who ate only to stay alive, not for any pleasure or nutrition. "I'll make a proper list," Clara said. "If we're going to do this, we might as well eat decent food." That evening, Clara prepared their first meal together as husband and wife. She made do with what was available, creating a simple but filling stew from the preserved meat and some potatoes she found in the root cellar. Jake ate mechanically, barely seeming to taste what was on his plate. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Clara tried to think of something to say that wouldn't sound forced or artificial. "The cattle look healthy," she finally offered. Jake glanced up at her. "You know about cattle?" "Not much," Clara admitted. "But I can see they're well fed and cared for." It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was something. Jake nodded and returned to his meal, and Clara felt like maybe they had managed to exchange a few normal words without complete awkwardness. After dinner, Jake disappeared outside to do evening chores, leaving Clara alone to clean the kitchen and explore her new home. The house felt full of ghosts. Helen's presence was everywhere. In the carefully chosen curtains, the books on the shelves, the rocking chair in the corner that looked like it hadn't been used in months. Clara understood that she was not replacing Helen in Jake's heart, or even in his daily life. She was simply filling a practical need, like hiring a housekeeper who happened to share his name. It wasn't romantic or exciting, but it was honest, and Clara found some comfort in that honesty. As she prepared for bed in her new room, Clara reflected on how different this wedding night was from anything she had ever imagined. There was no joy, no anticipation, no love, but there was also no fear, no pressure, no false expectations. Tomorrow she would begin the work of making this arrangement function for both of them. She would cook better meals, clean the neglected house, and try to create some small measure of comfort in their shared existence. Maybe in time they could at least become friends. It wasn't the marriage she had dreamed of, but it was the marriage she had, and Clara was determined to make the best of it. The first week of married life felt like walking on thin ice that might crack at any moment. Clara and Jake moved around each other with careful politeness, like two strangers who had accidentally been assigned to share the same hotel room. Every interaction was formal and measured, as if they were both afraid that one wrong word might shatter the fragile arrangement they had built. Clara woke each morning before dawn, determined to prove her worth as a practical wife. She would dress quietly in her room, then slip downstairs to start coffee and prepare breakfast before Jake finished his morning chores. The routine gave her purpose, something she had been missing during those desperate weeks living behind the church. The kitchen had become her first project. Years of bachelor living had left their mark everywhere. Grease stains on the stove that looked permanent. A pantry that was more like a storage closet for the bare minimum needed to survive, and dishes that had been washed but never properly cared for. Clara approached the cleaning with the intensity of someone fighting a war, scrubbing and organizing until every surface gleamed. Jake watched her work from a careful distance, and Clara could feel the weight of his attention even when she couldn't see him. Sometimes she would catch him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it gratitude, resentment, or something else entirely? She understood that having another woman in Helen's kitchen, touching Helen's dishes and rearranging Helen's space, must feel like a betrayal of his first wife's memory. "You don't need to change everything," Jake said one morning as Clara reorganized the spice cabinet she had found nearly empty. Clara paused in her work, a small tin of cinnamon in her hand. "I'm not trying to change things, just make them work better." Jake nodded curtly and retreated to the barn, leaving Clara to wonder if she was overstepping boundaries she didn't even know existed. The meals were the hardest part. Clara would cook breakfast and dinner every day, setting two places at the scarred wooden table where Jake had probably eaten alone for months. They would sit across from each other, the silence stretching between them like an invisible wall. The only sounds were the scraping of forks against plates and the occasional comment about whether it might rain or how the cattle were doing. Clara had always been a skilled cook, something she took pride in, but Jake ate everything with the same mechanical efficiency. He consumed her carefully prepared meals like a man taking medicine, necessary for survival but offering no pleasure. Sometimes Clara found herself remembering the joyful dinner conversations she had shared with her parents before they died, full of laughter and stories about their day, and the contrast made her feel even more isolated. After 2 weeks of this careful dance around each other, Clara decided she needed to do something that felt more productive than just cleaning. Helen's garden called to her every time she looked out the kitchen window. The roses were still alive under all those weeds, and Clara could see the skeleton of what had once been something beautiful. She started working in the garden during the afternoons, when Jake was usually out checking on the cattle or repairing fences. Clara had learned about gardening from her mother, who had maintained a small but lovely plot behind their house in Chicago. There was something healing about working with her hands, about coaxing life back into neglected soil. The roses were hardy varieties, still viable despite months of neglect. Clara pulled weeds with determination, her hands getting dirty for the first time in weeks. She found bulbs that would bloom in spring if given proper care, and herb plants that were struggling but not dead. This garden had been loved once, and Clara wanted to give it the chance to be loved again. One evening, Jake found her there as the sun was setting. Clara was on her knees beside the rose bushes, dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her forehead despite the cool October air. She looked up to find him standing nearby, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly, but his voice lacked the sharp edge it usually carried when he was trying to maintain distance. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her old apron. "I enjoy gardening, and these roses deserve a chance to grow again." Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking at the work she had already accomplished. The difference was obvious even after just a few days. The weeds were gone, the soil had been turned and loosened, and the rose bushes looked healthier already. "Helen loved those roses," Jake said finally, his voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "She spent hours out here every day during the growing season. Said it was her favorite place on the whole ranch. It was the most personal thing Jake had shared since their wedding day, and Clara chose her words carefully. She had excellent taste. These are beautiful varieties. With some care, they should bloom wonderfully next spring." To her surprise, Jake knelt down beside her and began pulling weeds with efficient, practiced movements. His hands were rough and calloused from ranch work, but he was gentle with the plants. They worked together in comfortable silence as the light faded, and Clara felt like maybe they had taken a small but important step forward. That night at dinner, Jake actually commented on the food for the first time since their wedding. "This stew is good," he said simply, but Clara felt a warm glow of satisfaction at the small compliment. "Thank you," she replied, and for the first time, their politeness felt less forced and more genuine. As the weeks passed, they began to develop routines that felt natural rather than awkward. Clara would have coffee ready when Jake came in from his morning chores, learning exactly how he liked it, strong and black, hot enough to steam in the cool morning air. He would wash up at the basin by the back door, and they would eat breakfast while discussing the weather and what work needed to be done around the ranch that day. Clara discovered that Jake was incredibly knowledgeable about ranching and farming. He could predict the weather with an accuracy that amazed her, reading signs in the sky and the behavior of animals that she was only beginning to notice. When he talked about the land and the cattle, some of his old passion showed through the grief that usually clouded his expression. "This land has been good to me," he said one day as they stood on the porch looking out at the pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully. Helen used to say it was the most beautiful place on earth. Clara could understand why Helen had loved it here. The mountains in the distance were magnificent, painted in shades of purple and gold by the changing light. The rolling hills were covered with grass that moved like waves in the wind, and the sky seemed to go on forever. But she could also see that Jake hadn't been taking proper care of the ranch since Helen died. There were repairs needed, improvements that could be made, opportunities being missed. "The fence by the East Creek needs attention," Clara observed one morning. Jake looked at her with surprise. "How do you know that?" "I've been watching the cattle when I'm working in the garden. Some of them keep wandering toward that creek, but they have trouble getting to the water because the fence is blocking their path. If it was repaired and moved back a few feet, they'd have better access to drink." Jake studied the fence line thoughtfully, and Clara could see him processing her observation. "You're right," he said finally. "I hadn't noticed that, but you're absolutely right." Clara felt a spark of pride at his acknowledgement. She might not be able to give Jake children or romantic love, but she could contribute to the ranch in ways he hadn't expected. She had good eyes for practical problems and logical solutions. They started working together more often after that. Clara would point out things she noticed that could be improved, and Jake would figure out how to fix them. She would hold boards while he hammered, or hand him tools while he repaired equipment. It wasn't romantic, but it was partnership in its most basic form. Evenings remained the most challenging part of their day. After dinner, Jake would usually retreat to his room or sit alone on the porch, while Clara would read by the fireplace or work on mending clothes. The silence between them felt heavy with all the things they weren't saying, all the grief and loneliness they were carrying separately. One night, Clara decided to try something different. She had been exploring Helen's books and had discovered that they shared similar tastes in literature. Helen had been an educated woman with good judgment in poetry and novels. "Would you mind if I read aloud?" Clara asked Jake, who was sitting by the fire working on carving a piece of wood into some useful tool. He looked surprised by the request, but shrugged. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt." Clara opened a book of poetry and began reading in her soft, clear voice. She had always enjoyed reading aloud. It was something she had done with the children she tutored back in Chicago, and she had a natural talent for bringing words to life. Jake continued his carving, but Clara could tell he was listening to every word. When she finished the first poem, he looked up from his work. "Helen liked poetry too," he said quietly. "I know. I can see her notes in the margins of some of these books. She had thoughtful opinions about what she read." Jake's hand stilled on his carving. "You don't mind reading her books?" "I think she would want them to be enjoyed, not just sitting on a shelf gathering dust." Books are meant to be read and shared. That became their new evening routine. Winter arrived in Montana like an unwelcome guest who planned to stay far longer than anyone wanted. By early December, snow was piled high against the windows of the ranch house, and the wind howled across the plains with a sound that made Clara think of lonely spirits searching for home. She had never experienced anything like a Montana winter, and the complete isolation it brought was more intense than she could have imagined. For days at a time, Clara and Jake were completely cut off from the outside world. The road to town became impassable, buried under drifts that reached higher than a man's head. Jake had to break trails through the snow just to reach the barn to care for the cattle. Coming back to the house with ice crystals frozen in his beard and his clothes stiff with cold. The forced closeness of being trapped indoors together began to change the careful dynamic they had established. There was nowhere to retreat when conversations became awkward, no outside work to escape to when the silence grew too heavy. They were stuck with each other, for better or worse, and both of them had to learn to navigate this new reality. Clara kept busy with indoor projects, cooking hearty stews and soups that would stick to their ribs during the brutal cold, mending clothes and linens, and organizing every corner of the house that had been neglected during Jake's months of grief-induced isolation. But even with all her activity, the walls seemed to press in on them as the days grew, shorter, and the wind never stopped its mournful song. The crisis that would change everything between them came on a bitter January morning when Clara woke up feeling dizzy and weak. She tried to get out of bed to start her usual morning routine, but the room spun around her like a carnival ride, and she had to grab the bedpost to keep from falling. Her head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and every muscle in her body ached. Clara forced herself downstairs to make breakfast, telling herself it was just tiredness from all the hard work she had been doing. But as the morning progressed, she felt worse instead of better. By noon, she was burning with fever, her body racked with chills that no amount of blankets could stop. Jake found her collapsed in the kitchen when he came in for the midday meal. One look at her flushed face and the way she was shaking told him this was serious. Clara was trying to stand up, one hand gripping the kitchen table for support, but her legs wouldn't hold her weight. "Clara?" Jake's voice was sharp with alarm as he caught her before she could fall. "How long have you been feeling sick?" "Since this morning," she whispered, her voice so weak he had to lean close to hear her. "I'm sorry about the meal. I was trying to get something ready for you." Even burning with fever and barely able to stand, she was apologizing for not fulfilling her duties. Something twisted painfully in Jake's chest at her words. This woman who had married him for nothing more than security was still trying to take care of him when she could barely take care of herself. Jake helped Clara back to her room, practically carrying her up the stairs. Her skin felt like fire against his hands, and he could feel her trembling with weakness. The nearest doctor was in town, 20 miles away through snow that would be impossible to navigate even in good weather. With the current blizzard raging outside, Jake was completely on his own, and Clara was getting sicker by the hour. He spent that first night bringing her water, trying to get her to sip small amounts even though she could barely keep anything down. Her fever climbed higher as the hours passed, and she began talking to people who weren't there, her parents who had died years ago, her former fiancé William who had abandoned her, and sometimes even Helen. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you children," Clara mumbled during one particularly difficult spell, her eyes unfocused and glassy with fever. "I know that's why nobody wants me. I know I'm broken." Jake froze in his chair beside her bed, realizing she was talking to him in her delirium. The raw pain in her voice cut through him like a knife. Here was this woman's deepest shame and fear, laid bare by illness, and it broke his heart in ways he hadn't expected. "Clara, you're sick," he said gently, placing a cool cloth on her burning forehead. "You need to rest and get better." But she was lost in her fever dreams, reliving old hurts and disappointments, voicing fears she would never have shared if she had been conscious. Jake sat beside her bed all night, listening to her unconscious confessions and feeling ashamed of how distant he had kept himself from this woman who was clearly carrying as much pain as he was. The second day was worse. Clara's breathing became rapid and shallow, and her lips were dry and cracked despite all the water Jake tried to give her. She couldn't keep food down, and the fever seemed to be consuming her from the inside out. Jake realized with growing panic that she might die, and the thought hit him harder than he had expected. He found himself praying for the first time since Helen's funeral, begging God not to take another person from his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was desperate to save a woman he had married only for convenience, a woman he had barely allowed himself to know or care about. Jake did everything he could think of to help her. He made thin broth and spooned it between her lips drop by drop, even when most of it ran down her chin. He bathed her face and arms with cool water to try to bring down the fever. He talked to her constantly, even when she seemed completely unconscious. because he had heard that sick people could sometimes hear voices even when they couldn't respond. "You're going to be all right," he told her over and over, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and worry. "I need you to fight this, Clara. Please don't give up on me now." He meant those words more than he had realized he would. Somewhere in the space of 2 days, Clara had stopped being just the practical solution to his household problems and had become someone he genuinely cared about losing. On the third night, Jake dozed fitfully in the chair he had pulled up beside Clara's bed, too worried to sleep properly. He woke to find her looking at him with clear, rational eyes for the first time in days. "Jake?" Her voice was weak and scratchy, but it was definitely her own voice, not the rambling of delirium. Relief flooded through him so powerfully that he had to grip the arms of his chair to keep his hands from shaking. "Thank God you're awake. How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle, but better." Clara tried to sit up and Jake quickly moved to help her, his hands surprisingly gentle as he arranged pillows behind her back. "You've been very sick for 3 days, Jake explained. "I was starting to think." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice how close he thought she had come to dying. Clara looked around her room, taking in the basin of water on the nightstand, the pile of damp cloths, the cup and spoon that showed evidence of his careful nursing. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized what Jake had done for her. "You took care of me," she said softly. It wasn't a question, the evidence was all around them. "Of course I did. You're my wife." Jake's response was automatic, but even as he said the words, he knew they didn't tell the whole truth. It had been more than duty that kept him by her bedside for 3 days and nights. "Thank you," Clara whispered, and Jake felt uncomfortable with the depth of gratitude and emotion in her voice. "You don't need to thank me. I couldn't get to town for the doctor because of the snow, but I wasn't going to just let you—" Again, he couldn't finish the sentence. As Clara slowly recovered over the following weeks, something fundamental shifted between them. Jake found himself checking on her more often than was strictly necessary, bringing her books to read while she regained her strength, making sure she was warm enough and eating properly. Clara, in turn, seemed more relaxed around him, less careful about maintaining the polite distance they had established at the beginning of their marriage. "I heard some of the things I said while I was sick," Clara admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. She had been strong enough to come downstairs for dinner, though Jake had insisted on helping her navigate the stairs. "I hope I didn't say anything too embarrassing." Jake considered this carefully. "You talked about a lot of things. Your parents, your life in Chicago, some of your worries, but nothing you need to apologize for." "I have nightmares sometimes," Clara continued quietly, staring into the flames. "About Chicago, about William calling off our wedding. I dream that everyone is staring at me, whispering about how I'm defective, how no decent man would ever want me." Jake set down the piece of leather he had been working on and looked at her directly. "You're not defective, Clara. I can't have children. In most people's minds, that makes me a failure as a woman. Most people are idiots," Jake said with surprising vehemence, and Clara looked startled by the force of his words. "You're one of the strongest, most capable women I've ever known. You've taken a neglected house and made it into a real home again. You see problems I miss and come up with solutions I never would have thought of. Any man who couldn't see your worth doesn't deserve you." It was the first real compliment he had given her since their wedding day, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for saying that." "I'm not just saying it to be kind," Jake replied firmly. "I mean every word. These past weeks, watching you work and seeing how you think about things, I've realized I was lucky to find someone like you, even if it happened in an unusual way." Spring came to Montana like a promise finally being kept. The snow that had imprisoned Clara and Jake through the long winter months began to melt, revealing a world that seemed to be waking up from a deep sleep. The sound of running water replaced the howling wind, and the first brave wildflowers pushed through the dark earth in Helen's garden, which Clara had so carefully tended the previous fall. The change in the weather seemed to mirror something that was happening between Clara and Jake. The walls of careful politeness that had defined their marriage were crumbling, replaced by something warmer and more genuine. Clara's illness had cracked open the protective shells they had both built around their hearts, and now neither of them seemed quite able to put those barriers back in place. Jake found himself seeking out Clara's company in ways that went beyond their practical partnership. He would linger over breakfast, asking her opinion about ranch matters that he had once handled entirely on his own. When he came in from the morning chores, he would tell her about what he had seen, a new calf that had been born overnight, or how the creek was running high with snowmelt, or the way the light looked different now that winter was finally loosening its grip on the land. Clara, for her part, seemed more confident and comfortable than she had ever been since arriving in Cedar Ridge. Her health had fully returned, bringing with it a vitality that Jake found himself watching and appreciating. She moved through the house with purpose and energy, humming while she worked, and Jake realized he had grown to love the sound of her voice filling the spaces that had been silent for so long. The biggest change came when Jake discovered Clara's remarkable gift with horses. He had been struggling for weeks with a wild Mustang he had managed to catch a beautiful chestnut mare with a spirit that refused to be broken by traditional methods. The horse was potentially valuable, but she fought every attempt to saddle her, rearing and striking out with her hooves whenever anyone tried to approach. Jake had worked with difficult horses before, but this one seemed determined to remain wild no matter what he tried. Clara had been watching from the fence one afternoon when Jake emerged from the corral, frustrated and covered with dust from another unsuccessful attempt to make progress with the mare. "Mind if I try?" Clara asked quietly. Jake looked at her in surprise. "She's dangerous, Clara. She's already come close to kicking me twice today, and I know what I'm doing around horses." "I know she looks fierce," Clara said, studying the mare with thoughtful eyes. "But I don't think she's mean. I think she's terrified." Against his better judgment and every instinct he had about horse safety, Jake found himself agreeing to let Clara try. What he witnessed over the next hour amazed him completely. Clara entered the corral slowly, making no sudden movements and keeping her voice soft and steady. Instead of trying to corner the horse or force any kind of interaction, she simply stood in the center of the space and waited. She talked to the mare in low, soothing tones, telling her about the weather and the other horses on the ranch, treating her like an intelligent creature worthy of conversation rather than just an animal to be dominated. The mare, clearly curious about this different approach, began to investigate. She would approach a few steps, then retreat, then approach again, her nostrils flaring as she tried to understand this strange human who wasn't demanding anything from her. By the end of that first afternoon, Clara had the horse taking sugar cubes from her outstretched palm. Within a week, she was brushing the mare's coat while the horse stood calmly, enjoying the attention. By the end of the month, Clara was riding her bareback through the pastures, the two of them moving together like they had been partners for years. "Where on earth did you learn to do that?" Jake asked one evening as he watched Clara dismount from the mare with fluid grace. "My father bred and trained horses when I was little. Back in Illinois," Clara explained, giving the mare a final pat before turning her loose in the pasture. "He always said you had to earn their trust instead of demanding their obedience. He taught me that horses are just like people. They respond better to kindness than to force." Jake began bringing Clara other difficult horses that neighboring ranchers had given up on, and she worked the same patient magic with each one. Word spread quickly through the community about Clara's unusual gift, and soon people were traveling from miles away to ask for her help with problem animals. She never turned anyone away, and Jake felt a growing sense of pride watching her work. The success with horses gave Clara confidence that spilled over into other areas of their life together. She began making suggestions about improving the ranch buildings and operations, and Jake not only listened to her ideas but actively sought her input on important decisions. "I've been thinking about that old bunkhouse," Jake said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "What about it?" Clara asked, setting down the mending she had been working on. "Right now it's just storage for things we don't really need. Seems like a waste of good space." Clara was quiet for a moment, and Jake could see her considering possibilities. Finally, she said hesitantly, "What if we turned it into a schoolroom?" Jake looked puzzled. "A schoolroom for what?" "There are several families in this area with children who have no proper school to attend. The nearest one is too far away for daily travel, especially in winter. I could teach them reading, writing, basic arithmetic, maybe some geography and history." As Clara described her idea, her whole face lit up with excitement in a way Jake had never seen before. She talked about how they could arrange desks, what books and supplies they would need, how they could organize lessons for different age groups. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Jake found himself caught up in her vision. "You really want to do this?" Jake observed. "And it wasn't a question. I was a governess and tutor in Chicago before everything fell apart," Clara admitted. "I loved teaching children, watching them discover new ideas and seeing their faces when they finally understood something that had been difficult for them. I've missed that work more than I realized." Jake made his decision without hesitation. "Then let's do it. Tomorrow we'll ride into town and order whatever supplies you need." Clara stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Really? You'd support something like that?" "Really. If it makes you happy, then I want to help make it happen." That night, Clara couldn't sleep from excitement. She lay in her bed making mental lists of everything they would need, planning lessons, imagining the faces of children when they learned to read their first sentences or solve their first arithmetic problems. For the first time since leaving Chicago, she felt like she had found a way to use her skills and education for something meaningful. From his room down the hall, Jake could hear Clara moving around, and he found himself smiling at her restless energy. This was the first time since their marriage that he had seen Clara truly excited and happy about something, and her joy was contagious. He realized he would do whatever it took to keep that light in her eyes. The schoolhouse project brought them even closer together. They worked side by side for days, cleaning out the old bunkhouse, building simple desks and benches, and painting the walls a cheerful yellow that reminded Clara of sunshine. Jake found himself looking forward to these working sessions more than he had expected, enjoying Clara's company and conversation in ways that surprised him. One evening, as they were putting the finishing touches on the last desk, Clara got a streak of yellow paint on her nose. Jake reached out without thinking and gently wiped it away with his thumb. The simple touch sent an unexpected shock of awareness through both of them. They froze, looking into each other's eyes, suddenly conscious of how close they were standing and how intimate the gesture had been. Jake's hand lingered on Clara's cheek for a moment longer than necessary, before he pulled it away, his heart beating faster than it should have been. "Sorry," he said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. "It's all right," Clara whispered, but her own heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with the work they had been doing. That moment marked a turning point in their relationship. They began sitting closer together in the evenings, their conversations becoming more personal and intimate. Jake told Clara about his dreams for expanding the ranch, about the son he and Helen had lost, about how empty and meaningless his life had felt after Helen died. Clara shared her own stories in return, about her childhood with parents who had loved her deeply, about her humiliation when William abandoned her, about her fears that she would never be wanted or valued by anyone. These conversations created a bond between them that went deeper than their practical partnership had ever reached. "I never thought I would feel like I belonged anywhere again," Clara confessed one night as they sat on the porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "You belong here," Jake said simply, and he meant it more than he had ever meant anything. "This is your home now, Clara. Really your home, not just a place where you happen to live." The first time Jake kissed Clara, it happened on a warm May evening when the air was sweet with the scent of blooming roses. 2 years after their quiet, desperate wedding in an almost empty church, Clara and Jake stood in the exact same spot where they had once exchanged vows born of necessity and survival. This time, however, the church was packed with friends and neighbors who had come to witness something truly beautiful, the renewal of marriage vows between two people who had discovered that love could bloom in the most unexpected soil. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric. Jake had insisted on buying her from the finest bolt in the general store. The pale yellow color reminded everyone of the wildflowers that now bloomed abundantly in Helen's restored garden, which had become one of the most beautiful spots in all of Cedar Ridge. Jake stood beside her in his best suit, but this time his eyes were bright with joy and anticipation instead of dulled with grief and reluctant duty. When they looked at each other now, there was warmth, laughter, and the deep understanding that came from two souls who had helped each other heal from wounds that once seemed impossible to mend. The church was filled with people whose lives Clara and Jake had touched over the past 2 years. Many of the children Clara taught in her little school sat in the front pews with their parents, their faces scrubbed clean and their hair combed neat for the special occasion. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was there, wiping happy tears from her eyes as she remembered the desperate young woman who used to sit on the church steps with nowhere to go. Reverend Matthews stood before the congregation with a smile wider than anyone had seen from him in years. 2 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. These two people came together seeking practical solutions to difficult problems. Clara needed security in a home. Jake needed help finding his way back to the world of the living. Today we celebrate how God can transform even the most businesslike arrangements into something sacred and beautiful. The vows they exchanged this time were written in their own words, full of promises that went far beyond mere survival and convenience. Jake's voice was strong and sure as he spoke directly to Clara, his hands holding hers steadily. Clara, when you came into my life, I thought my story was over. I was just existing from one day to the next, going through the motions of living without any real purpose or joy. You didn't just fill the empty spaces in my house. You helped me remember what it felt like to have hope for tomorrow. You showed me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that loving again doesn't diminish what came before. I promise to love you with everything I have, to encourage your dreams, and to stand beside you in whatever adventures we build together. Clara's voice trembled with emotion as she responded, but her words were clear and heartfelt. Jake, you gave me so much more than just a home when I had nowhere else to turn. You saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself. You helped me understand that I'm not broken or defective, just different, and that different can be something wonderful. You supported my dreams even when they seemed impossible, and you made me feel like I truly belong somewhere for the first time in years. I promise to love you with my whole heart, to be your partner in all things, and to help you remember every single day how precious and beautiful our life together is. When they kissed this time, the church erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very rafters. The little school that Clara had started in the converted bunkhouse had become the heart of their community, bringing families together and giving their children opportunities they never would have had otherwise. The success of her teaching had made Clara one of the most respected women in the area. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with long tables set up in the yard under strings of lanterns that Jake had hung from the trees. The entire community turned out to honor the couple who had become such an important part of their lives. Clara's school now included 18 children from 8 different families, ranging in age from 6 to 15. Some of them were already reading better than their parents, and several of the older ones were learning advanced mathematics and science that would prepare them for opportunities beyond ranch life. Jake's ranch had also prospered beyond anything he had achieved even in his happiest days with Helen. Clara's sharp mind for business and her ability to see practical solutions to complex problems had helped him expand his operations and improve his methods. They now ran one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory, and their advice was sought by ranchers from miles around. During the party, Mrs. Phillips, whose son Danny was one of Clara's brightest students, pulled Clara aside for a private conversation. "Do you remember when you first came to town, dear?" Mrs. Phillips asked with a warm smile. "You used to sit on those church steps every morning looking so lost and hopeful at the same time." Clara nodded, though the memory didn't carry the sharp pain it once had. "I remember feeling like I was the loneliest person in the world, like nobody would ever want me around. Look at you now," Mrs. Phillips said, gesturing toward the celebration around them. "You're the heart of this whole community. Those children absolutely adore you. My Danny talks about Miss Clara from morning until night. Their parents respect and appreciate everything you've done for their families. And Jake?" She paused with a knowing smile. "Well, anyone with eyes can see how completely that man loves you." Clara looked around at the scene surrounding her. Children playing games in the yard while their parents talked and laughed around the tables. Neighbors who had become genuine friends celebrating with them. Jake deep in animated conversation with other ranchers about cattle and weather, and the best methods for training horses. This was her life now, full and rich in ways she had never dared to imagine during those desperate weeks when she first arrived in Cedar Ridge. The biggest change in their home had come about 6 months ago, when Jake had finally felt ready to pack away Helen's personal belongings. Clara had helped him carefully fold Helen's dresses and store her books and personal items in the attic, not to be forgotten or discarded, but to make room for their shared future as a married couple. "She would be happy for us," Jake had said as they worked together one afternoon, handling Helen's things with gentle respect. "Helen always said she wanted me to have a full, meaningful life, She would love knowing that you're here, taking care of the garden she planted and filling the house with laughter again. Clara had found a beautiful photograph of Helen. Among her belongings, a portrait that showed a lovely woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. Clara had asked Jake if she could frame it and place it on the mantel in their living room, not as a shrine to the past, but as a way of honoring the woman who had loved this house and this man before her. "Thank you," Jake had said simply when he saw the photograph in its place of honor, and Clara knew he meant thank you for understanding. Thank you for not being threatened by his first love. Thank you for helping him hold on to the good memories while still embracing their future together. Their marriage had taught them both that love didn't have to be perfect from the beginning to be real and lasting. Sometimes the most enduring love grew slowly and steadily, built on a foundation of respect, shared work, and the willingness to see the best in each other even during difficult times. Clara had learned that her worth as a woman and as a wife wasn't determined by her ability to bear children. The young people she taught called her Miss Clara and brought her wildflower bouquets and proudly showed off their reading progress to anyone who would listen. She was helping to raise and educate the next generation of their community, and her influence would last far beyond anything she might have accomplished as a biological mother. Jake had learned that moving forward with his life didn't mean forgetting or betraying what he had shared with Helen. His heart, which he had been convinced was permanently broken, had proved capable of healing and growing and making room for new love without diminishing his memories of the past. As the evening wound down and their guests began heading home to their own ranches and farms, Clara and Jake walked hand in hand to Helen's garden, now in full spectacular bloom. The roses climbed the new trellis Jake had built, their sweet perfume filling the warm night air. The vegetable garden Clara had added was producing enough food to feed them through the winter with plenty left over to share with neighbors. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Reverend Matthews hadn't suggested our arrangement?" Clara asked as they stood among the flowers, listening to the peaceful sounds of their horses moving in the nearby pasture. Jake considered the question seriously. "You would have found your way somehow. You're much stronger and more resourceful than you knew back then. What about you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the man he had been 2 years ago. "I think I might have spent the rest of my life just existing instead of truly living. You saved me, Clara, even though I was too stubborn and grief-stricken to see it at first." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the vast Montana sky. The house behind them glowed with warm lamplight, and they could hear the gentle sounds of their animals settling in for the night. Tomorrow. Clara stood by the old wooden church, watching the dust settle on Main Street. Her blue dress, the only nice one she owned, felt too big on her small frame. The other women who came on the train with her 2 weeks ago were already gone. They had found husbands quickly and moved into their new homes with smiles and hope in their eyes. But Clara remained. She sat on the church steps every morning, hoping someone might change their mind about her. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge walked by, some nodding politely, others whispering behind their hands. She knew what they were saying. Everyone in this small Montana town had heard her story by now. 3 years ago in Chicago, Clara had been engaged to a banker named William. Everything was perfect until the doctor told her the truth she had feared for years. She could never have children. When William found out, he called off the wedding the day before the ceremony. Clara stood in her wedding dress that day too, but instead of walking down the aisle, she watched her dreams crumble. The shame followed her everywhere in Chicago. People looked at her differently, like she was broken somehow. Her own family started treating her like a burden. That's why she decided to answer the mail-order bride advertisement. She thought maybe in a new place with new people, she could start fresh. She was wrong. The men in Cedar Ridge wanted wives who could give them children, who could help build families and carry on their names. When they learned about Clara's condition, they politely declined. One by one, they chose other women. The pretty ones went first, then the young ones, then even the older women who had some savings or special skills. Clara had nothing special to offer except her willingness to work hard and be a good wife. But in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, that wasn't enough. Mrs. Henderson from the general store brought her bread sometimes. She was kind but always looked sad when she saw Clara. "Maybe you should go back home, dear," she would say gently. But Clara had no home to go back to. She had used her last savings to come here. The train station agent, Mr. Phillips, kept asking when she wanted to book passage back east. But Clara couldn't afford a ticket. She was trapped in a place where nobody wanted her, with no way to leave. She spent her days helping at the church, cleaning and organizing things for Reverend Matthews and his wife. They let her sleep in the small room behind the church in exchange for her work. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping outside. At night, Clara would lie on the narrow bed and wonder what would happen to her. She was 26, which made her an old maid by most people's standards. She had no family to take her in, no skills that could earn her enough money to live alone, and no prospects for marriage. The other women in town were polite but distant. They had husbands and families to think about. Clara understood why they kept their distance. She reminded them of their own fears about what could happen if they lost their husbands or couldn't have children. Sometimes Clara would walk to the edge of town and look out at the vast Montana landscape. The mountains in the distance looked beautiful but cold. The endless sky made her feel even smaller and more alone than she already did. She had been brave when she left Chicago. She thought she was starting a new adventure, that maybe God had a plan for her that she couldn't see yet. But as the days turned into weeks, her hope was fading fast. Every morning she would brush her brown hair and put on her dress, trying to look presentable in case someone might notice her. She would smile when people greeted her, pretending she wasn't dying inside from loneliness and rejection. The worst part wasn't being alone. The worst part was feeling like she didn't belong anywhere in the world. She was too damaged for the men who wanted perfect wives, too proud to beg for charity, and too poor to make a new start somewhere else. Clara had always been a fighter. When her parents died when she was 16, she found work as a seamstress to support herself. When William broke her heart, she picked up the pieces and kept going. But this felt different. This felt like the end of all her possibilities. She would sit on those church steps, watching families walk by, seeing children playing in the street, observing the easy way married couples moved together. She wanted to be part of that world so badly it physically hurt. But wanting something and being able to have it were two very different things. Clara was learning that lesson the hard way in the small town of Cedar Ridge, where she remained the bride that nobody wanted.